And then for each review now is actually a web page. So I'm trying to connect to the New Yorker right now. And hopefully that'll come up in a second. But I can see the list of reviews here on the left-hand side, and I can actually read the review of the Despicable Me now in the New Yorker. All right? So that's what the app does. So the way I built this app is one of the nice things about Rotten Tomatoes, they actually give you 9 different APIs that you can use. The way they design them, though, is pretty clever. Every API returns the same format of data. So this is an interesting thing. Another interesting thing you'll find when you start to dig into these open data APIs. Some of them are well designed, some of them are not. Or some of them just they weren't able to do something based on the data they're returning that is as clean as this. So each one of these APIs, and I've got them documented in my code, returns the same structure. It's a list of movies, as you saw before in that JSON that I showed you. I've also written a sample app that uses Edmunds, which is, if you've ever been to Edmunds.com, that's where you can go look up new and used car information. Right? So they have a developer API. Their developer API is one of the most complex that I've seen because they have a vehicle API, they have a dealer API, they have a deals API, and they have, I believe, a reviews API. And then, so each one of those APIs is actually a collection of calls, and each one of their calls returns a different format. So you actually have to study each individual API and determine what the structure of it is to be able to deal with the data. So again, just be aware of that. So I've defined the APIs for Rotten Tomatoes. I've got them all defined in here, so I can actually change this application to not show in theaters information. I could change it to show DVD top rentals. So how would I do that? Well, let's see. The best way to understand this is to probably set a few breakpoints. So let's see. We're going to set a breakpoint right there and right there. So this is the point in code where I'm actually going to invoke the in-theaters API. It's defined as a string. The next thing that happens is we take that and we use an object in the WinRT class library called HTTP client. That's the class that allows me to invoke a URL. So I simply instantiate that, and I call the getString async. That makes that API call. We'll set a breakpoint here as well so we can see what comes back. The next thing I do, now remember, that comes back as JavaScript object notation. It's going to come back as a string, a giant string that has all that movie information in it. So how do I deal with it in my application? The first step I have to do is do something called deserialization. And there's a library that does it for me. It takes that string and it will deserialize it into an object model in memory for me. So the only extra work I had to do was actually define what that object model is. Well, there are tools that do that for you automatically, so you don't have to necessarily write that code. But once that code is generated, you end up with a class that looks something like this. So I've got Rotten Tomatoes movies, has a collection of type movie, and a movie is made up of an ID and a title and a year and a rating and a runtime. This is all that same information you saw in the JSON, right? But now it's represented as a C# class. And so the deserialization process takes the string of JSON and turns it into a runtime object model based on this class structure here. One line of code does that. All right? You simply have to have the classes defined, and there are tools that generate it for you. And it's this line of code right here that actually does the work. All right, so we'll walk through that. Now, remember, we're using model view, view model, right? But what I get back from Rotten Tomatoes is not a view model, it's a data model. So now that I have all this movie information, it's extremely rich. It's more information than I want to put on the screen. And it's not in the format that's bindable to the user interface controls. So I have to map from the data model to a view model, and then after that, one line of code binds it to the UI. So I have to define my view model. So a view model would look something like this. It's a movie, well, this is the reviews. Let me scroll down. I'll get to the movie information. We'll start there. I have a movie item. It's derived from this base class. Now, why is that? Well, let me scroll up because I scrolled past it already. On Windows, what makes a class bindable is that it implements the interface iNotifyPropertyChanged. Model view, view model means that you put your data in the form of a view model. You bind it to the UI control. Could be a list view, could be a drop-down, a combo box, a grid control, something like that. If the user interacts with it and changes it, you want your view model to be notified that the data has changed. If your program changes the view model, you want the model view to be notified that the data has changed and update automatically. All of that machinery of keeping the model view in sync with the view model, the model view in sync with the view model, is handled automatically by the platform. Whether you're HTML5 and JavaScript or you're C# XAML, C++, that's handled automatically. You simply have to derive from the right, implement the right interface. In this case, it's iNotifyPropertyChanged. And there's the implementation. So now that that's implemented, I can now derive classes from this base class that are my view model. And that's all that's going on in this particular file right here. So if I come down, where was I? Movie item. All right, so here's my movie item that's bindable. And it's simply it defines the data that I want to be able to put on the screen, and then accessors, get and set accessors. That's it. Very straightforward code. And I'm being instant messaged by someone out at corporate, so just ignore that. So let's see. So that's the view model. The last thing I want to show you is, okay, now that everything's in the view model, then what happens? Well, when that call returns all the way back up to my user interface layer, I'm going to end up here in the response from the call. I'm going to get the data. I'm going to copy it from the data model to the view model, and this is the line of code that binds it to the UI. We take all the movie data and we simply say it's the default view model for this. Let me bring up this particular UI layout, which is implemented in XAML. There's the binding definition right there, collection view source. So that's one of the nice features about the platform, is a lot of that plumbing, all that capability that you expect these types of applications to have, it's built into the framework, the class libraries that we provide in WinRT. You just need to know how to wire it up. When dealing with open data APIs, you're going to make a call, you're going to get back that string of JSON, you're going to deserialize it into a data model. You're going to map the data model to a view model, and then simply and then your binding code will pick up after that, and you've got it on the screen. Now, I wanted to show an app that was built that way, but it's in HTML5 and JavaScript. Now, this is not my code, but I'm going to do my best to try to at least point out a couple of couple of interesting parts here. Interesting, in JavaScript, that whole, invoking the API and getting back that string of JSON, that doesn't happen in JavaScript. Why? It's coming back in JavaScript object notation. So the nice thing about calling these APIs from JavaScript is you get back an object model by default. In C#, I had to map the string to an object model, so it's one extra step in the implementation.